The November wind was cruel that night, howling through the cracks in the old bridge. The moon hung low, veiled in a thin mist, as Elliot leaned against the railing, the icy metal biting through his gloves. Below, the river churned, black and wild, threatening to swallow anything that dared to meet it. That was when he saw her. Clara stood at the center of the bridge, her back to him, a pale figure draped in a thin white dress. She didn't belong there, not in the cold, not at that hour. "Clara?" Elliot called out, his voice hesitant, carried away by the wind. She didn't turn around. "Hey, it's freezing out here." He took a step forward, his boots crunching against the frost-covered planks. "What are you doing?" Still no response. Then, as if drawn by an unseen force, Clara stepped forward, her bare feet soundless on the icy bridge. Elliot's stomach twisted. She was too close to the edge now, her toes hanging over the abyss. "Stop!" he shouted, breaking into a run, but it was too late. She turned to him finally, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Her expression wasn't one of fear, but of relief, a sad smile tugging at her lips. The next instant, she was gone. Elliot reached the edge, breathless, his hands gripping the railing. The river below was as empty as the night. The wind gnawed at Elliot's face, cold and bitter, carrying with it the sting of memories he wished to bury. The bridge loomed ahead, its iron rails frosted over, gleaming faintly under the pale moonlight. Snow fell softly, blanketing the quiet mountain village, but even its pristine beauty couldn't smother the unease that had settled in Elliot's chest. He hadn't wanted to come back, not to this place, not to the memories tied to it. Yet here he was, walking the familiar road that led to the one spot he had sworn never to visit again, the bridge. He stopped at the edge, his breath misting in the frigid air. Below, the river raged, its black waters churning against jagged rocks. It looked as it always had, violent, cold, unwelcoming. And yet, it wasn't the river that haunted him. It was her. Clara. A gust of wind swept past him, whispering through the cracks in the bridge's iron frame. For a moment, it sounded like laughter. Her laughter. Elliot clenched his fists and forced himself to look down. No one was there. Of course not, she was gone. She had been gone for a year. But the wound she left behind hadn't healed. November had been colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and stayed there. Elliot had been walking home from the village square, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets when he first saw her. Clara stood at the bridge's center, a thin figure cloaked in white, her golden hair dancing in the wind. She shouldn't have been there. It was too late, too cold. "Clara," he called, his voice breaking the stillness. She didn't turn. Her gaze was fixed on the river below, her expression unreadable. "Hey!" Elliot quickened his pace, boots crunching against the frost-covered planks. "What are you doing out here? It's freezing!" Still, she didn't respond. As he drew closer, he noticed something strange. Her dress was wet, clinging to her skin as if she had just climbed out of the river. "Clara," he said again, softer this time. He reached out, but before his hand could touch her shoulder, she turned to him. Her eyes, usually warm and bright, were empty. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. And then she smiled, a sad, haunting smile that sent a shiver down his spine. "Goodbye, Elliot," she whispered. Before he could react, she stepped backward. Time seemed to slow as her body tipped over the edge, her arms spread wide, her hair fanning out like golden flames. And then she was gone, swallowed by the darkness below. Elliot froze. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. When he finally forced himself to look over the railing, the river was empty. No body, no sign of her, just the black water, rushing endlessly into the night. A sharp crack jolted Elliot from his thoughts. He turned sharply, scanning the bridge. It was empty, save for the snow-covered tracks his boots had left behind. The sound came again, this time louder, a snapping noise, like ice breaking under pressure. Elliot's pulse quickened. He took a step back from the railing, his eyes darting to the shadows cast by the iron beams. And then he saw it, a faint figure, standing at the far end of the bridge. "Clara?" The name escaped his lips before he could stop it. The figure didn't move. It was hard to see through the swirling snow, but the shape was unmistakable. A woman in a white dress, her golden hair shimmering faintly under the moonlight. It couldn't be her. It wasn't possible. Elliot's heart pounded as he took a step forward, his boots crunching against the ice. "Clara?" he called again, louder this time. The figure tilted its head, as if hearing him for the first time, and then with deliberate slowness it turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the blizzard. Elliot hesitated. Every fiber of his being told him to turn back, to leave the bridge and the memories behind. But the figure, her figure, beckoned him forward, even as it disappeared into the swirling snow. His breath came in shallow puffs as he took another step, then another until he was running, the frost crunching underfoot. "Wait!" he shouted into the wind. The figure didn't stop. The blizzard thickened, snow whipping around him in chaotic spirals. His visibility dwindled, but he could still make out the faint silhouette ahead. The closer he got, the colder it felt, as if the air itself had turned hostile. He barely noticed when the snow beneath his boots gave way to something harder, more solid. It wasn't until he stumbled to a halt that he realized where he was. The old town square. The place had been abandoned for decades, ever since the mining company pulled out of the mountains. What remained were skeletal buildings, their wooden frames warped by time and weather. Snow coated the rooftops and ice hung from the beams like jagged teeth. It was a ghost town, quiet, lifeless. But not tonight. The figure stood in the center of the square, motionless, surrounded by swirling snow. Elliot's heart thundered as he approached, his breath fogging the icy air. "Clara?" he called again, his voice cracking. She didn't move. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer. The white dress hung loosely on her thin frame, and her hair, once vibrant and golden, was pale, almost translucent. She stood with her back to him, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. "Clara," Elliot said again, softer this time. His voice trembled, carrying with it all the guilt and sorrow he'd been running from for a year. "It's me. It's Elliot." Finally she moved. Her head turned first, slowly, unnaturally, followed by her shoulders. When she faced him fully, Elliot's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Clara, not entirely. Her eyes, once so warm and full of life, were clouded over, gray and empty. Her lips were pale, cracked, but they twisted into the same haunting smile he had seen on the bridge that night. "Why did you let me fall?" she whispered. Elliot staggered back, his chest tightening. I didn't." His words faltered as he searched her face, desperate for some sign of humanity. "I tried to save you. I didn't want you to." "You watched," she interrupted, her voice hollow. "You didn't stop me. You let me fall." "No." Elliot's voice echoed through the square, startling even himself. He clenched his fists, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I tried to grab you, I swear I did. It was too late. You—" Her smile widened, stretching unnaturally across her face. "You didn't try hard enough." Elliot bolted upright, the memory of her words echoing in his ears. He was back in his father's house, the old wooden floors creaking beneath the weight of his footsteps as he paced the living room. Snow piled against the window panes, muting the world outside, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The dream, or was it a dream, felt too real. He could still hear Clara's voice, cold and accusing, as if she were standing right behind him. He rubbed his face with trembling hands, trying to steady his breathing. A faint creak interrupted his thoughts. Elliot froze, his eyes darting to the hallway. The sound came again, softer this time, like footsteps on the old wooden stairs. His pulse quickened as he stepped toward the noise, his bare feet cold against the floorboards. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer. He crept toward the staircase, each step agonizingly slow. The house groaned around him, its ancient walls shifting with the weight of the snow outside. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he peered upward, straining to see through the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then, faintly, a shadow moved at the top of the stairs. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice steadier now. The shadow didn't move. It lingered for a moment, then melted into the darkness. Elliot's heart pounded as he climbed the stairs, his hand gripping the banister so tightly his knuckles turned white. At the top, he found his father's study door ajar. The room smelled of old wood and dust, a time capsule untouched since his father's death. Elliot stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shelves of books and faded photographs. On the desk, something caught his attention, a small leather-bound diary, its cover worn with age. He reached for it, his fingers brushing the cold surface. As he opened it, a single page fell loose, drifting to the floor. He bent to pick it up and froze. The page was blank, except for a single word scrawled in crimson ink. Guilty. Elliot's hand trembled as he held the page. The word guilty seemed to pulse on the paper, as if alive, mocking him in the dim light. He glanced around the study, his breath catching in the silence. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched pressed down on him, thick and suffocating. This isn't real," he muttered, his voice a shaky whisper. "It's just in my head." But the diary begged to differ. As he flipped through its pages, he realized the rest were blank. No dates, no notes, nothing but the accusing word written in dark, dried ink. He set the diary down and backed away from the desk, his mind racing. A faint creak behind him. He spun around, his eyes darting to the doorway. The shadows seemed to ripple, shifting with the flickering light of the storm lamp. "Who's there?" he called, his voice louder this time. Silence. Then, a whisper. "You know who." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It slid through the air like ice against his skin, chilling him to the core. Elliot's breath quickened as he took a step toward the door, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. "Clara?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost gentle. "Come find me." The hallway stretched before him, dark and endless. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the far end, growing fainter with each passing second. He followed them, his bare feet hesitant against the cold floorboards. The footsteps led him to a door he hadn't opened in years, his childhood bedroom. It had remained untouched, a relic of simpler times, back when the world made sense. He pushed the door open, and the faint smell of dust and old wood greeted him. Inside, the room looked the same as it always had. A small bed with a patchwork quilt, a rickety desk littered with forgotten trinkets, and a window overlooking the snowy fields. But something was different. On the bed, a bundle of white fabric lay crumpled, as though someone had hastily tossed it there. Elliot stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. The fabric wasn't just white. It was a dress. Her dress. The same one Clara had worn the night she fell. It was damp, water dripping from its hem, pooling on the floorboards in a dark, spreading stain. His breath hitched as he reached out, his fingers brushing the cold, wet fabric. The moment he touched it, a sharp pain shot through his head and the room around him shifted. He was back on the bridge. The air was colder, the wind sharper, cutting through him like shards of glass. Clara stood at the edge, her back to him, the golden strands of her hair glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Clara!" Elliot shouted, his voice desperate. She didn't respond. He ran to her, his feet heavy against the frost-covered planks. "Please don't do this. I'm sorry. Whatever it is, I'm sorry." She turned slowly, her eyes hollow and lifeless. "Sorry?" she said, her voice distant, echoing through the empty night. "You're not sorry. You're afraid." "No." He reached for her, but his hands passed through her like smoke. "Clara, I swear." Her laughter cut him off, sharp and bitter. "You think this is about me?" She tilted her head, her smile widening. "It's never been about me. It's about you, your lies, your guilt." "I didn't lie," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I tried to save you." Her eyes darkened, her smile twisting into something cruel. Then why did you let me fall? The wind roared around them, the river below churning violently. Elliot fell to his knees, the weight of her words crushing him. I didn't let you fall, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It wasn't my fault. Clara knelt before him, her cold fingers brushing against his cheek. Oh, Elliot, she murmured, her voice soft and laced with pity. You've been telling yourself that lie for a year, but deep down, you know the truth. Her face twisted, her features contorting into something inhuman. You killed me. Elliot gasped, his body jolting upright as he found himself back in the house. The bedroom was dark, the faint light of the storm barely illuminating the dress on the bed. He stumbled back, his chest heaving as Clara's voice echoed in his mind. You killed me. He turned toward the mirror hanging on the wall, desperate for some anchor to reality, but the reflection that greeted him wasn't his own. Clara stared back at him from the glass, her lifeless eyes boring into his. Blood dripped from the corner of her mouth, staining the white dress that clung to her skeletal frame. Why? She whispered, her voice raspy and broken. Why did you do it? I didn't, Elliot screamed, his fist slamming against the wooden frame. The glass cracked beneath his hands, spiderwebbing across her face, but her reflection didn't waver. You can't hide from the truth, Elliot, she said, her voice cold and sharp. The bridge remembers, the river remembers, and so do I. The glass shattered, shards raining down around him, but the sound was drowned out by the howling wind. When he turned back to the bed, the dress was gone. In its place was the diary, open to a new page. This time the word wasn't guilty. It was murderer. Elliot stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat as the word murderer stared up at him from the diary. The crimson ink glistened as though it had just been written, the letters jagged and aggressive, tearing at the page itself. His hands trembled as he slammed the diary shut, but even then, he felt its weight pressing on him, an accusation that would not relent. No, he whispered, shaking his head. It wasn't murder. It wasn't my fault. But the house disagreed. A loud crash erupted from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, hurried and uneven. Elliot froze, his heart hammering. The steps didn't retreat. They were coming closer, pounding against the creaking floorboards, relentless and heavy. Who's there? He shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The steps stopped just outside the door. The silence was deafening, a void that made his chest tighten. Elliot grabbed the nearest object, a heavy candlestick from the bedside table, and stepped toward the door. His hand hovered over the doorknob, the cold metal biting into his skin. Gathering his courage, he yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. The shadows seemed deeper now, the light from his storm lamp barely penetrating the darkness. He stepped out cautiously, the wooden floorboards groaning under his weight. The air was colder here, sharp and biting, as though the house itself resented his presence. The sound of dripping water broke the silence. Elliot turned, his eyes narrowing as he followed the sound. It was coming from the staircase, each drop echoing like a clock ticking down. As he descended, the sound grew louder, more insistent until he reached the front hall. A puddle had formed at the base of the stairs, dark and spreading. He knelt, hesitant, and touched the liquid. His fingers came away red. Blood, he muttered, his stomach twisting. He looked up. The trail of blood led to the study, the door slightly ajar as though inviting him in. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to leave this house and never return, but he couldn't, not yet, not until he understood. With a deep breath, he pushed the study door open. The study was exactly as he'd left it, or so he thought. The diary sat on the desk, closed now, but its presence felt more menacing than before. The blood trail led directly to it, pooling around its base as if the book itself were bleeding. Elliot swallowed hard and stepped closer, his breath fogging in the cold air. Show me, he whispered, unsure why he said it, but knowing he had to. If this is what you want, show me the truth. The room darkened, the shadows stretching and twisting around him. The diary flew open. its pages flipping rapidly, faster than any wind could cause. Then suddenly it stopped. The room fell silent. Elliot leaned over the book, his eyes scanning the page. There, in the same crimson ink, were words he didn't want to read. "You didn't stop me. You pushed me." He staggered back, shaking his head. "Number. That's not true. That's not what happened." The room seemed to disagree. The shadows grew, wrapping around him like tendrils, suffocating and cold. His vision blurred, and the world around him shifted once more. He was back on the bridge, but this time it was different. The snow wasn't falling, the wind wasn't howling. Instead, the air was thick with an oppressive silence. The sky was a dull gray, and the river below was eerily still, its surface smooth as glass. Clara stood at the edge again, her back to him. "Clara," he called, his voice breaking. She turned to him, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, sadness, anger. "You remember now?" she said, her voice soft but laced with venom. "No," he said, taking a step back. "This isn't real. You jumped. I tried to stop you. You were already." "Already what?" she interrupted, her tone sharp. "Broken? Alone? You think that excuses what you did?" "I didn't push you," he shouted, his voice echoing across the empty landscape. Clara stepped closer, her feet soundless on the frosted planks. "Didn't you?" she asked, her eyes boring into his. "Think, Elliot. Think about what you said. Think about what you did." The memory hit him like a tidal wave. The argument had been heated, their words cutting through the cold November air. Clara had confronted him about something, his lies, his betrayal. He couldn't remember the details, but he remembered the anger, the way it bubbled up inside him, blinding him to everything else. "You're pathetic," she had screamed, her voice shaking. "You don't care about anyone but yourself. And you're a burden," he had snapped back, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. "Do you even realize how much easier my life would be without you?" Her face had crumpled, the tears freezing against her cheeks. She had backed away, her steps slow, deliberate, until she reached the edge of the bridge. "Maybe you're right," she had said, her voice barely audible over the wind. And then, in his rage, in his frustration, he had taken a step forward. Elliot fell to his knees, the weight of the memory crushing him. "I didn't mean it," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't think she would. I didn't." Clara knelt before him, her icy fingers brushing his cheek. "But you did," she said softly, her voice tinged with both sorrow and malice. "And now, you have to pay." The river roared to life behind her, its black waters churning violently. The bridge began to shake, the planks creaking under the pressure. Clara's smile widened as she reached out, her cold hands wrapping around his wrists. "Time to come home, Elliot," she whispered. And then she pulled,